In 2005, Vladimir Putin called the collapse of the Soviet Union the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. How could this be? Had the Soviet Union not been the evil empire? An oppressive regime which killed millions of its own people, who conquered Eastern Europe, Mongolia, and Afghanistan, subjugating them to imperial control, who deracinated the cultures of its constituent nations and promoted atheism, who made a mockery of psychology by labeling all who oppressed it mentally ill, and who economically deprived its citizens by building the most powerful military in history at the complete neglect of their consumer goods? Yes, this is all true. That state certainly had skeletons in its closet. That is all that is written, though, in our history books about the collapse. That the collapse was a glorious triumph of American liberal democracy over the evils of Marxism and all other political systems. History had ended, and liberal democracy would be the system for all time. And we are told that this was bloodless and peaceful. That could not be further from the truth. What followed was a wash of blood and misery, a second time of troubles for Russia and Eurasian civilization. The defeat of the Soviet Union in 1991 was just as severe as the defeat of the Central Powers in 1918 and the defeat of the Axis in 1945. The dissolving of this union was not supported by the populace, and this was shown directly and transparently in a 1991 referendum where 74% of the general population supported the continuance of the Soviet Union. The Soviet republics were severed from one another after centuries of union, in the midst of a severe depression manufactured by the state itself in Gorbachev's hubris and ignorance. The leaders of the collapsing Soviet Union had given up the nation to complete defeat without firing a single shot in their own defense. To the republics of the Soviet Union and the people betrayed by their leaders, obviously this proved to be the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. For large swaths of the Soviet Union, the quality of life, standard of living, and even GDP has yet to reach the levels that existed prior to the collapse. And what followed in the wake of this collapse, the end of the flawed existing socialism, was not rivers of milk and honey in a prosperous new world order. What followed was the shame of being a defeated nation. The economic reforms that the republics undertook were supposed to give the citizens the economic goods that they had seen on the bootlegged VHS tapes of programs from the West. What they got was one of the most severe depressions in human history, the decimation of wildly popular guarantees, which ensured, though a Spartan lifestyle, one much less anxiety-prone than life in the capitalist West. These market reforms led to the rise of a set of criminal oligarchs who could pull the strings of power throughout the former Soviet Union, a set of men so debased that their antics made Soviet propaganda about the evils of capitalism seem meek and understated in comparison. In the wake of the collapse, the Russian Cross was born all across Eastern Europe, a demographic trend of decline where deaths outnumbered births and nations have begun to shrink. A demographic black hole which has threatened and continues to threaten to this day the continuing existence of Eastern European and Slavic nations. Alcoholism and drug abuse have become endemic. Vast swaths of the Soviet Union still not recovered to the standards of living which they enjoyed before Gorbachev. And poll after poll has indicated that overwhelming majorities preferred the Marxist states to their current neoliberal replacements. The collapse was not bloodless in the slightest. Outside the deaths from crime, overdoses, and the decline of healthcare, there were and continue to be a set of horrible wars. The Caucasus drowned in blood and chaos just as thick as which was in Yugoslavia. Central Asia and Eastern Europe, while not as intense as the wars which have been suffered in the Caucasus, have seen a great deal of civil conflicts, one of which today, the Donbass, is one of the greatest threats to the continuing existence of international world order. At the turn of the century, in the invasion of Dagestan, it seemed that the Russian Federation itself was doomed to collapse into a civil war. A war which had been irrevocably destructive to the human race, given Russia's vast supply of nuclear weapons and their ability to use them. But the Russian people on the precipice of annihilation scream no! And have thus risen again to become a great world power. On a geopolitical perspective, the collapse of the Soviet Union was absolutely a catastrophe. The United States now has no restraint and check to its power. As Fukuyama had declared, history was over, and liberal democracy has won. And its destiny is to shape the entire history of the Earth. And rule is the single ideology of the New World Order. Globalization could now begin without any impediment that the Soviets had been swept away. America, the once great nation born of the Faustian will of manifest destiny, had been grotesquely corrupted by culture distorters, and these culture distorters were now firmly in control of the shape of the world's destiny. Woe to those who oppose them. They would be annihilated by the strong arm of the neoconservative foreign policy. Arab nationalists were annihilated, the post-Soviet states were color-revolutioned, and all socialist and third-positionists have been excluded. The culture distorters has transformed out from many one, from the slogan of federalism into the slogan of global multiculturalism. It spread across the world, as all cultures were to be annihilated and subsumed into a monocultural global homo world order. Europe, it seems, has been completely consumed by it, with the exception of those parts which were communists and allied to the Soviet Union. The greater and greater the sincerity of communism was amongst the people, the harder they resist now against global homo. Thus, the overwhelming reality comes to light across the broader West. Communism is superior to liberalism.